6, the boy said, holding up fingers that weren't fingers. 6 is the number of moons on Tessara. 6 is the number of songs my mother sang before the burning. 6 is the number of days I have been alone. Garrett Cole stood in his doorway, a mug of cold coffee in one hand and a stack of unmarked composition books under his arm, and stared at the child on his front step. The child stared back. He was small, chest-high at best, with skin the color of pale ash, eyes so large and dark they swallowed the morning light whole, and ears that tapered to delicate points and rotated independently, tracking the street noise behind him with the mechanical precision of satellite dishes. He wore a garment that might once have been a ceremonial robe, deep indigo fabric threaded with silver wire, now torn at the hem and stained with mud and something darker. His feet were bare. His toes, he had 6 of those too, Garrett noticed curled against the cold stone of the step. "You're standing on my newspaper," Garrett said, because his brain had not yet caught up with the situation, and his mouth was running on the only protocol it knew: small talk. The boy looked down. He stepped off the folded broadsheet and stood precisely 1 foot to the left, hands clasped in front of him, posture so formally upright it looked rehearsed. "I require education," the boy said. "I was told the educator lives at the stone house with the blue door." Garrett looked at his door. It was blue. He'd painted it himself 3 years ago when he'd taken the posting at the Caldera Valley Settlement School, not because he liked blue, but because the Colonial Supply Depot had been out of everything else. The blue door had become a landmark. Delivery drivers used it. Parents used it. Apparently alien children used it too. "School starts at 8, Garrett said. "It's 6:15. "I know. I came early so I would not be late." Something caught in Garrett's chest, a sound, or the absence of one. The boy's voice was steady, his syntax too precise, his diction shaped by a translator implant that stripped away accent and idiom and left behind sentences that sounded like they'd been assembled by committee. But underneath the mechanical clarity, Garrett heard the thing the translator couldn't flatten: the thinness, the vibration of effort it took to hold the voice level. The boy was working harder to sound composed than any child should have to work. Garrett set his coffee on the doorframe ledge. He crouched down slowly, the way he'd learned to do with the younger settlement kids who came to school carrying more fear than lunch, and rested his forearms on his knees. "What's your name?" "Renchi of the 6th Choir of Tessara." A pause. "The 6th Choir is gone now." "I'm Mr. Cole, Garrett, if you want." He paused then. "Have you eaten?" The ears rotated forward, both of them in unison, locking onto him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. "No." Garrett stood. He held the door open. "Come inside, I'll make breakfast." The Caldera Valley settlement sat in the crook of a basalt canyon on a world the colonial authority had named Thoreau's 4, and the locals called Dust Bowl with varying degrees of affection. The settlement was small, 400 humans, a handful of Chelsea traders, 2 Drenathi mechanics who kept the water reclamation system running, and a rotating cast of migrant workers who came for the mining season and left when the thermal vents shifted. The streets were cobblestone, laid by the original colonial engineers who had believed cobblestone was dignified, and had not anticipated how quickly the canyon dust would fill the gaps and turn every surface into a gray, gritty paste. Garrett had been teaching here for 3 years. Before that, he'd taught at the Orbital Academy on Meridian Station, proper classrooms, proper funding, students whose parents had proper expectations. He'd left after his wife died. Not dramatically, not in a blaze of grief and thrown furniture, but in the slow, quiet way that a person leaves a room they can no longer breathe in. He'd applied for the most remote posting the Colonial Education Authority offered, and they'd given him Thoreau's 4, which was so remote that the posting had been open for 2 years before he took it. His school had 12 students. He taught all subjects in a single room with a chalkboard, 3 rows of desks, and a window that faced the canyon wall and offered, on clear days, a view of exactly nothing. He was not a good teacher. He knew this with the honest, unflinching clarity that men past 50 sometimes achieve after enough loss has stripped away the comfortable lies. He was competent. He could explain photosynthesis and long division, and the colonial charter with reasonable precision. But the warmth that good teachers carried, the instinct for when a child needed a joke or a firm word or simply to be seen, had been damaged in him, and he had not figured out how to repair it. He taught like a man assembling furniture from instructions, all the pieces connected, all the joints tight, but the thing that resulted was functional rather than beautiful. Renchi was sitting at his kitchen table eating oatmeal, with the concentration of a demolitions expert disarming a device. He held the spoon in both hands, gripping it near the base, and brought each bite to his mouth with deliberate precision. His ears rotated constantly, tracking Garrett's movements in the kitchen, the sounds from the street, the click of the heating unit cycling on. "How did you get here?" Garrett asked, sitting across from him with his reheated coffee. "To the settlement." "I walked from the transit depot at Canyon Ridge, 4 days. That's 60 kilometers through open desert. I walked at night. During the day I slept under rock formations." Renchi took another bite of oatmeal, chewed, swallowed. "My people are suited to temperature extremes. My internal thermoregulation is more efficient than yours." He said it without pride, a statement of biological fact, delivered with the same flat precision as everything else. "Why did you come here?" Renchi set the spoon down. His hands, Garrett noticed, were trembling slightly, not from cold, from the effort of holding them still. "The transit depot processes orphan children for labor redistribution under the Tessaran Reclamation Compact. Children without family markers are classified as unclaimed assets and assigned to industrial work programs. I was assigned to a mining operation on Thoreau's 4 northern shelf." He paused. "I left." "You ran." "I walked at a moderate pace. Running draws attention." Garrett stared at him. The boy stared back. Those enormous dark eyes held steady, unblinking, the pupils so wide they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. There was no self-pity in his expression, no plea, just the calm, exhausted dignity of someone who had decided to survive and was executing that decision with the tools he had. "The labor program," Garrett said carefully. "Will they come looking for you?" "Yes. The Reclamation Compact assigns recovery agents to retrieve unclaimed assets who deviate from their assignments. The agents are typically Thrani mercantile enforcers. They operate under commercial license, not military authority." Another pause. "They are persistent." "How persistent?" "They recovered a child from a refugee camp on Kelvar 7 after she had been sheltered there for 9 months. They do not stop." Garrett took a long drink of his coffee. It was bitter and barely warm, and it did nothing for the cold weight settling in his stomach. "All right," he said, "finish your oatmeal. School starts in an hour." The first day was a disaster. Not a dramatic disaster. No explosions, no screaming, no alien child-related emergencies that required evacuation. Just the slow, grinding disaster of a boy who did not know how to be a child among children, and a teacher who did not know how to help him. Garrett introduced Renchi to the class with the brief, neutral language he used for all new students. "This is Renchi. He'll be joining us. Be decent." 12 faces turned to look at the ash-skinned boy standing at the front of the room with his hands clasped and his ears rotating like periscopes. Some of the faces were curious. Some were wary. Tam Akaro, who was 13 and had opinions about everything, leaned over to his neighbor and whispered something that made the neighbor cover a grin. Garrett pointed Renchi to an empty desk in the second row. Renchi walked to it, sat down, placed his hands flat on the desk surface, and did not move for the next 40 minutes. He did not take notes. He did not ask questions. He did not look at the other students. He sat with his back perfectly straight, and his eyes fixed on the chalkboard with an intensity that suggested he was trying to memorize every mark on it, including the ones Garrett hadn't made yet. When Garrett asked the class a question about watercycle mechanics, Wrenchy's ears rotated toward him, but his mouth remained closed. At morning break, the other students filed outside to the yard. Wrenchy remained at his desk. "Break time," Garrett said. "You can go outside." "I prefer to remain here." "It's not optional. Everybody goes outside for break. House rules." Wrenchy stood. He walked to the door, stood on the threshold, and stopped. The yard was a rectangle of packed dirt bordered by a low stone wall, and the other students had already sorted themselves into the loose clusters that children form without instruction. The older kids on the wall, the younger ones chasing each other, two Chelsea students doing something complicated with a ball that involved 3 hands each. Wrenchy stood on the threshold and watched them with the focused attention of a field researcher, observing an unfamiliar species. "You can sit by the wall if you want," Garrett offered. "Where on the wall?" "Anywhere." Wrenchy walked to the wall, selected a position precisely equidistant from the nearest students on either side, and sat with his hands in his lap. He did not speak to anyone. No one spoke to him. His ears rotated slowly, cataloging the sounds of play the way a linguist might catalog the phonemes of a language they did not yet speak. After 15 minutes, Garrett rang the bell and everyone filed back inside. The afternoon was worse. Garrett assigned a writing exercise, describe a place you remember, and Wrenchy produced 4 sentences in handwriting so precise it looked printed. Tessara had 6 moons. The light they made was silver. The 6th choir sang beneath them every evening. The choir hall burned on the 14th day of the reclamation. Garrett read it standing at Wrenchy's shoulder and felt something twist behind his sternum. He opened his mouth to say something. What? He didn't know. What did you say to 4 sentences that contained an entire world and its destruction, and closed it again? He set the paper on the desk and moved on to the next student. After school, Wrenchy stood at his desk and waited. "You can go," Garrett said. "Go where?" The question landed like a stone dropped in still water. Garrett set down the papers he was sorting and looked at the boy. The exhaustion was showing now in the slight droop of his ears, in the way his hands had stopped their formal clasp and hung loose at his sides, in the barely perceptible sway of his body as his balance wavered. "Where have you been sleeping?" "Under the stone bridge at the south end of the settlement. The acoustics are favorable. I can hear approach from both directions." Garrett picked up his keys. "Come on, you're staying with me tonight." He didn't say tomorrow. He didn't say from now on. He said tonight, because tonight was as far as he could see, and he had learned a long time ago not to make promises his certainty couldn't back. He gave Wrenchy the cot in the storage room, a narrow space off the kitchen that he'd been using to store boxes of old lesson plans, and a broken lamp he kept meaning to repair. He cleared the boxes, laid down a mattress pad, and found a wool blanket in the closet that smelled like cedar and neglect. "It's not much," he said. Wrenchy sat on the edge of the cot and ran his fingers along the blanket's weave. His ears were angled forward, both of them, focused on the texture under his hands with an attention that made Garrett realize the boy had not touched anything soft in a very long time. "It is adequate," Wrenchy said. "You don't have to be polite." "I am not being polite. I am being accurate." Garrett stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, feeling the specific discomfort of a man who had lived alone for 3 years and had calibrated his entire existence around solitude. His routines were precise. Wake at 5:30, coffee, walk to school, teach, walk home, grade papers, eat something forgettable, read, sleep. The routines left no room for another person, and the rooms, both the physical ones and the ones inside his chest, had grown to fit the shape of his aloneness the way tree roots grow around stone. Now there was a boy in his storage room, and the stone was shifting. Bathrooms through the kitchen, second door on the left. I'll leave a towel out. There's more oatmeal if you're hungry. Thank you, Mr. Cole. Garrett. Thank you, Garrett. A pause. Good night. Garrett closed the door. He stood in his kitchen and listened to the small sounds of the boy settling, the creak of the cot, the rustle of the blanket, the faint click of those rotating ears adjusting to the room's acoustic signature. Then silence. He poured himself a drink he didn't want and sat at the kitchen table and thought about what he was doing, which was harboring a fugitive child from a labor compact enforced by mercenaries. He decided that thinking about it was not going to help and went to bed. He lay in the dark and thought about it anyway. The awkwardness of living together became specific in the second week. It collected in the gaps between routine like dust in the grooves of cobblestone, not dramatic, not confrontational, just persistently, irreducibly there. Renchi did not know how to accept kindness, not in the way that neglected children sometimes flinch from contact. His body didn't recoil, his expression didn't shudder. He simply did not have the programming. When Garrett set a plate of food in front of him, Renchi would look at the plate, look at Garrett and say, "Thank you," in a tone that suggested he was following a protocol rather than expressing an emotion. When Garrett told him he could use the books on the shelf, Renchi would select one, read it cover to cover in a single sitting, return it to its exact position, and say nothing about it. When Garrett said, "Good morning," Renchi would respond, "Good morning, Garrett," with the same flat precision, as though morning were a fact he was confirming rather than a moment he was sharing. It drove Garrett slightly mad, and he knew that was unfair. The boy had spent his formative years in institutions that treated affection as currency and kindness as a transaction with hidden terms. Of course he didn't trust it. Of course he held it at arm's length and examined it for traps. Garrett had done the same thing after Laura died. People had been kind to him, and he had received their kindness with the mechanical gratitude of a vending machine accepting coins. Input registered, output dispensed, no internal change. The difference was that Garrett had been an adult making a choice. Renchi was a child executing a survival strategy. The wall he'd built was too clean, too symmetrical, too well-engineered for someone his size. Someone had taught him to build it. Someone had made it necessary. There were other complications. Renchi's biology operated on cycles that Garrett couldn't predict. Some mornings the boy's skin was cool to the touch, almost cold, and he'd sit wrapped in the cedar blanket with his ears flat and his eyes half closed, conserving energy the way his species did during what he called the dim phase. Other mornings he was almost feverishly warm, radiating heat that Garrett could feel from across the kitchen table, and his ears would be in constant motion, scanning everything, processing frequencies that human ears couldn't detect. "I can hear the water moving through the pipes in the walls," he told Garrett once, matter-of-factly. "And the settlement's power generator has a bearing that will fail within 19 days. Garrett told the settlement engineer. The bearing failed in 17 days. After that, the engineer started stopping by once a week to ask Renchi what else he could hear. The cooking was another frontier of awkwardness. Garrett's repertoire consisted of oatmeal, canned stew, and a pasta dish he made with dried sauce packets that tasted like cardboard seasoned with regret. He had not cooked for another person since Laura, and the muscle memory of cooking for two had atrophied into the efficient minimalism of cooking for one. Open can, heat, eat standing at the counter, wash the single bowl. Now there were two bowls, and the second one belonged to a boy whose species processed certain human proteins differently, which Garrett discovered when Renchi ate a full portion of canned stew and spent the next 2 hours sitting very still with his ears flat, managing what he described as gastrointestinal distress caused by an incompatibility between tessar and enzyme profiles and the specific protein chains found in your preserved meat products. You could have told me you can't eat that, Garrett said, standing in the doorway with a glass of water and the guilt of a man who has accidentally poisoned a child. I did not know. I have never eaten human food before. The oatmeal was compatible. I extrapolated incorrectly that all your food would be. After that, Garrett started reading about Tessaran dietary requirements on the settlement's data terminal. The information was sparse, but he pieced together enough to modify his cooking. More grain, more root vegetables, no preserved meat. He found himself, for the first time in 3 years, actually thinking about meals before he made them. One evening, Renchi stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him chop tubers. You are preparing food with deliberate attention to my biological requirements, Renchi observed. I'm making dinner. For 2 people with adjustments. This is different from your previous pattern. People adjust. On Tessara, the preparation of food for another person is considered an act of significant social commitment. It indicates that you have accepted responsibility for their continued existence. Garrett paused mid-chop. That's a lot of weight to put on a tuber. It is cultural context. I am providing it for informational purposes. Noted. Set the table. Renchi set the table, 2 plates, 2 cups, 2 sets of utensils, arranged with geometric precision. He stood back, surveyed the arrangement, and adjusted 1 cup by approximately 2 millimeters. In school, the boy was a paradox. He absorbed information with a speed that bordered on predatory. Garrett would introduce a concept, and Renchi's ears would lock forward, and his eyes would go dark and focused, and you could almost hear the gears turning as the boy filed the information into whatever immaculate internal architecture he maintained. His test scores were perfect. His homework was precise. His participation was 0. He did not raise his hand. He did not volunteer answers. He did not speak unless directly addressed, and when addressed, he answered in the minimum number of words required to satisfy the question. The other students had moved from wariness to bemused acceptance. Renchi was the quiet one, the strange one, the one who sat in the second row and always knew the answer but never said it. Then Tam Okoro made contact. Tam was 13 and had the emotional diplomacy of a border collie, enthusiastic, relentless, utterly undeterred by the social signals that would have stopped a more perceptive child. He dropped onto the wall next to Renchi at morning break with the boneless sprawl of a teenager who considered gravity optional. Hey, you know the answer to number 7, right? The one about thermal conductivity. Renchi's ears rotated toward Tam. Yes. What is it? 17.4 watts per meter Kelvin, assuming standard atmospheric pressure and a silicate composite medium. Tam stared at him. How do you just know that? I read the textbook. The whole thing. It was not long. Tam grinned, a sudden unguarded crack across his face. You're weird. I like it. Sit with us at lunch. Renchi looked at Garrett, who was standing by the schoolhouse door pretending not to watch. Garrett gave a small nod. Renchi turned back to Tam. Where do you sit? By the big rock, you'll see it. It's the only big rock. At lunch, Renchi sat by the big rock with Tam and 2 other students. He said almost nothing, but his ears tracked the conversation with the attentive rotation of a child learning a language that had nothing to do with words. And when Tam made a joke about the Chelsea students' 3-handed ball game, one of Renchi's ears tilted at an angle Garrett hadn't seen before. It took him a moment to realize it was amusement. The breakthrough in the classroom came 3 days later, by accident. Garrett was teaching planetary formations, core density, tectonic activity, surface geography. Standard curriculum. He was drawing a cross-section of a terrestrial planet on the chalkboard when Renchi's hand went up. Every student in the room turned. Renchi had never raised his hand. The gesture looked slightly wrong, too rigid, held at an angle that suggested he had observed others doing it, and was replicating the motion from memory. Garrett set the chalk down. Renchi. The diagram is incomplete. You have not included the interaction between core thermal output and subsurface aquifer systems, which on silicate worlds with active cores creates a convection pattern that significantly affects surface geology. How do you know that? Tessara was a silicate world with an active core. The Sixth Choir settlement was built above a major aquifer junction. The elders taught geological science as part of the cultural curriculum because understanding the aquifers was essential to survival. A pause. I can draw the convection pattern if you would like. Come up and draw it. Renchi walked to the chalkboard and began drawing with factory-clean precision. Lines so straight they looked ruled, annotations so neat they looked printed. In 4 minutes, he had added a complete subsurface aquifer convection system, with heat flow arrows, mineral deposit zones, and water table levels marked at precise intervals. The class was silent. Tam whispered, "What the hell?" with reverential awe. The Sixth Choir understood that water is not merely a resource, Renchi said, still facing the board. It is a language. The way it moves through stone tells you what the planet is thinking. My mother said that. He set the chalk down. She was the choir's geologist. He walked back to his desk and sat down. His ears were rotating rapidly, reading the class's response with the anxious precision of someone who has just exposed something and is not sure whether exposure was a mistake. "That's good work," Garrett said. "Class, copy the updated diagram. There'll be a question on it Friday." After class, Tam caught up with Renchi. "You should talk more. That was actually interesting. You made water sound like it had opinions." "Water does not have opinions." "Yeah, but you made it sound like it does. That's a skill." Renchi considered this. "Thank you, Tam. Would you like to know what the water under this settlement is doing?" "Obviously." They walked to the big rock together, and Garrett watched from the steps and did not follow, because some doors opened better when no one was watching. The first door in the wall opened on a Thursday evening, 10 days after Renchi's arrival. Garrett was grading papers at the kitchen table. Renchi was sitting cross-legged on the floor in the storage room doorway, reading a book about terrestrial oceanography that he'd pulled from the shelf without asking. One of the small victories Garrett had stopped commenting on because commenting on them made Renchi self-conscious, and self-consciousness closed more doors than it opened. Without preamble, the boy appeared fully in the kitchen. "Garrett." "Yeah." "The book says that Earth's oceans contain 97% of the planet's water." "Sounds right." Tessara had no oceans, only ice fields and subsurface aquifers. The Sixth Choir's settlement drew water from a bore well that reached 400 meters below the surface. A pause. The boy's hands were still, resting on the book's spine, but his ears were rotating in the slow, searching pattern that meant he was navigating uncertain ground. "The water tasted like minerals and cold stone. I can still remember the taste exactly. Tessaran memory is eidetic for sensory input. I will remember it until I die." Garrett set his pen down. He looked at the boy. Renchi was not asking for anything, not comfort, not a response, not even acknowledgement. He was offering something, a piece of himself, extended tentatively across the distance between them, the way you might hold out a hand to see if something will bite. "That sounds like good water," Garrett said. Renchi considered this. It was adequate, and then, after a moment, yes, it was good. He went back to his reading. Garrett sat at the table and stared at his papers, and did not grade anything for a long time. The second door opened in the schoolyard, and it opened loudly. Tam Okoro had organized a game, a bastardized version of Capture the Flag, adapted for a yard with one big rock and no flags, using instead 2 pieces of chalk that the teams had to steal from each other's territory and bring back to base. It was chaotic and loud, and governed by rules that changed every 30 seconds based on Tam's mood and his opponent's objections. Renchi stood at the edge and watched. "Come on," Tam said, grabbing his arm. "You're on my team. You can hear everything, right? You're basically radar." Renchi looked at Tam's hand on his arm. He looked at the game. He looked at Garrett, who was sitting on the school steps with his coffee. "I do not know the rules," Renchi said. "Nobody knows the rules. That's the point." Renchi went. He stood at the back of his team's territory, ears rotating, and for the first 3 minutes he did nothing but catalog. Then a member of the opposing team tried to sneak along the far wall, footsteps deliberately light, and Renchi's head snapped toward the sound before the player had taken 2 steps. "There," he said, pointing. "Behind the wall, moving left. One individual, trying to control their breathing, which means they know they are being listened for." The team erupted. 3 players converged on the sneaker, who was caught and dramatically tagged. When they came back, Tam threw his arm around Renchi's shoulders, the easy, careless gesture teenagers deploy without thinking, and Renchi went rigid. Every muscle locked. His ears flattened halfway before catching themselves. His hands clenched at his sides. But he didn't pull away. And when the next round started, he was the one who said quietly, "They will try the right side. The acoustics suggest 3 of them are gathering near the shed. One is a decoy, the breathing pattern is too controlled. The other 2 are the actual runners." Tam howled with delight, "See, radar." After the game, Renchi sat by the big rock with the others, breathing harder than he wanted to show, and for the first time in Garrett's observation, the boy laughed. It was small, barely more than a breath, a slight upturn at the corners of his mouth that flickered and vanished like a spark that wasn't sure it was allowed to catch. But it was real. Garrett, watching from the steps, felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in 3 years. Something warm and painful and completely inconvenient, like blood returning to a limb that had been numb so long he'd forgotten it was his. The enforcers arrived on a Tuesday. Garrett was midway through a lesson on colonial governance, a topic none of his students found interesting, and he didn't blame them when the settlement's constable appeared in his doorway. Petra Hess was 53, former colonial marine, built like a fence post and about as flexible. She kept her voice low, but Garrett saw Renchi's ears lock forward the instant she spoke, and he knew the boy was hearing every word. 2 Thrani, commercial enforcement license, parked at the transit gate. Recovery warrant for an unclaimed juvenile asset, species classification Tesseran. They've got his transit number. Garrett set the chalk down. His hand was steady. The rest of him was not. "How long?" "They're processing entry paperwork with the settlement clerk. Mikkel's dragging it out, lost forms, system errors, the usual frontier hospitality. Maybe 2 hours, maybe less if they push." He looked at his classroom. 12 faces with the mild curiosity of children who sense the room's atmosphere has changed, but can't name it. In the second row, Renchi sat with his hands flat on the desk, ears locked forward, eyes on Garrett. The boy's face was composed. His hands were pressed so hard against the wood that his knuckles had gone white. "Class," Garrett said, turning back to the room. "Free reading period. Pick a book, stay quiet. I'll be back shortly." He stepped into the hall with Petra and closed the door. "What's the legal framework?" "Reclamation Compact, Article 3, Commercial Recovery of Unclaimed Juveniles. Ironclad inside their jurisdiction. Bilateral authority on any colonial world that signed the trade agreements, which Thoreau's 4 did." "What about his enrollment? He's been in my school for over 2 weeks. Petra shook her head. "Enrollment isn't custody, not under the compact. He stays classified unclaimed until a formal adoption petition clears the colonial family authority, and that process takes 8 to 12 weeks minimum. He'll be in a mine before the ink dries." "I know." Garrett leaned against the corridor wall. What if I file today? You can file. Won't stop the warrant. The petition is a process. They don't wait for processes. So what stops them? Legally, nothing I can enforce directly. The compact supersedes local law. She paused. But they don't know where the child is. They've got a transit number, not a current location. The warrant authorizes recovery, not search. They need cooperation or they need to find him themselves. And if nobody cooperates, then they start looking. A Seathrani with a commercial license and a transit tracker can cover a settlement this size in a day. She looked at the closed classroom door. You've got hours, Garrett, not days. Garrett straightened. He looked at the stone wall opposite, the one he'd been leaning against for 3 years, the one that had never felt like anything but cold stone. It didn't feel like cold stone now. It felt like the wall of a schoolhouse, and there was a boy behind the door, and the wall was the only thing between the boy and the people who wanted to turn him into an entry in a ledger. I filed the petition 40 minutes ago, he said. Walk to the clerk's office before first bell. It's in the system. Petra looked at him. Something shifted behind her eyes, not surprise exactly, recognition. The expression of someone who had seen people draw lines before and knew what it cost. All right, she said, then we buy time. He went back to his classroom. He taught the rest of the afternoon with the precise, mechanical calm of a man who has decided that normal is the most defiant thing he can be. Long division, sentence diagramming, a reading comprehension passage about mineral cycles on terrestrial planets. The students worked. Wrenchy worked. Garrett stood at the chalkboard and kept his hands steady and his voice level, and did not once look at the window facing the transit gate. After school, he dismissed the class and asked Wrenchy to stay. The boy sat at his desk. Garrett sat on the edge of his own desk facing him, and for a moment neither spoke. The afternoon light came through the window at a low angle, catching the dust and turning it gold. Wrenchy's ash-gray skin looked silver in that light, and his ears were angled at Garrett with such focused attention that the teacher felt as though he were being weighed. You heard everything the constable said. Yes, Tesseran hearing does not require proximity. Then you know they're here. I knew they would come. The recovery interval for escaped assets under the compact averages 18 days. I have been here for 16, a beat. I had hoped for 20. Why 20? 20 would have meant they assigned my case to a secondary team. 16 means a priority unit. The Seathrani do not assign priority units for low-value assets. Someone has placed additional value on my retrieval. Who? I do not know, but the 6th Choir held cultural artifacts and archival records of considerable historical worth. It is possible that I am considered an index to their location. His voice remained flat, clinical. A map stored in a child. Garrett rubbed his face with both hands. Here's what's going to happen. I filed an adoption petition with the Colonial Family Authority this morning. Petra witnessed it. It's in the system. Case number CF 4471T. Wrenchy's ears shifted a fractional movement. Garrett had been watching those ears for 2 weeks and he knew what the shift meant. Surprise. The face didn't show it. The voice didn't show it. But the ears gave him away every time. An adoption petition does not override a valid recovery warrant. No, but it creates a competing legal claim. Competing claims require adjudication. Adjudication requires a hearing. Hearings require a colonial magistrate. The nearest magistrate is on Meridian Station, 4 days transit from here. That delays recovery. It does not prevent it. No. Silence, dust turning in the light. Outside, a door closed and a voice called across the cobblestone. Then why did you file? Garrett looked at him. The boy's eyes were steady, dark, enormous. His hands flat on the desk, pressed hard, knuckles white. Face composed. Posture perfect. He looked like a child who had practiced being brave so many times that the practice had become indistinguishable from the real thing. Garrett recognized it. He had done the same thing for 2 years after Laura, composed his face each morning until it looked like a person who was managing, and walked out the door wearing that face like a uniform. "Because I'm your teacher," Garrett said, "and the lesson today is that when someone comes for one of my students, I don't hand them over. I file paperwork." Something moved behind Renchi's eyes. Not a flinch, not a crack. Something quieter, like a door, locked for a long time, testing its hinges to see if they still worked. "That is not a lesson from the curriculum," Renchi said. "No, it's extra credit." The Seathrani came to the school at dawn. 2 of them, tall, narrow-bodied, elongated skulls, skin like burnished copper in the early light. Commercial enforcement uniforms, dark fabric, utility belts, the coiled chain sigil of the Tessaran Reclamation Compact on their left breasts. Flat amber eyes, pupilless, and they moved with the patient gait of predators who had never needed to rush because nothing they pursued had ever escaped for long. Garrett was on his front step, coffee in hand, when they came up the cobblestone. He watched them approach the way you watch weather. "Garrett Cole," the taller one said, not a question. "Educator, Caldera Valley Settlement School. You have enrolled a Tessaran juvenile, transit designation T6619, in your educational program." "I've enrolled a student named Renchi in my school. I don't track transit designations." "The designation is assigned by the Reclamation Compact. The juvenile is classified as an unclaimed asset. We hold a valid recovery warrant. You will produce the asset." Garrett took a sip of his coffee. He'd made it strong this morning, because he'd been up since 4 reading legal documents until the words blurred. "I've filed an adoption petition with the Colonial Family Authority. Case number CF 4471T. The petition creates a competing custodial claim, which under Section 19 of the Colonial Family Code requires adjudication before any transfer of the minor can proceed." The Seathrani exchanged a glance, a brief exchange in their own language, a sound like metal filings sliding across glass. "The Reclamation Compact supersedes Colonial Family Code," the shorter one said. "In matters of general commercial asset recovery," agreed. "But Section 19 specifically addresses cases where a custodial claim has been filed for a minor residing within an active educational jurisdiction. The minor cannot be removed from the jurisdiction pending adjudication." Garrett paused. "You're welcome to verify with the colonial magistrate on Meridian Station. 4 days transit each way." He had no idea if Section 19 said that. He had spent the night reading every legal document on the settlement's data terminal, and what he'd found was a thicket of jurisdictions and competing authorities so dense that no one, not the Seathrani, not Petra, not the magistrate herself, could parse it without weeks of review. The law was not on his side. But the law was not clearly on theirs either, and in frontier law, ambiguity was a weapon that favored whoever was willing to stand in the doorway longest. "We will verify," the taller Seathrani said. "If your claim is without basis, the penalty under the compact includes criminal obstruction and forfeiture of your colonial posting." "I understand." "You would risk your position for one unclaimed juvenile." Garrett looked at the Seathrani. Their flat amber eyes held no malice. They were not cruel. Cruelty required emotional investment, and these 2 were executing a task. They had recovered children before. They would recover children again. The child was a line item, a transit number, a file to be closed. They did not hate Renchi. They did not think about Renchi at all. He was not a person to them. He was an entry in a ledger that had been misplaced. "He's not unclaimed," Garrett said. "I claimed him yesterday in writing, filed and witnessed." The Seathrani did not leave the settlement. They rented a room at the only boarding house and began contesting the petition through official channels. Every morning, a new communication arrived on Garrett's data terminal, a filing, a demand, a citation of some subclause he had never heard of and suspected they were interpreting creatively. Every morning, he responded with a counterfiling, citing a different subclause he'd found by reading until his eyes burned. He was not a lawyer, he was a teacher. But the two professions, he was discovering, shared a critical skill: the ability to say things with absolute authority regardless of how uncertain you actually were. The settlement helped, not with speeches or rallies. Frontier people didn't work that way. They helped the way they always helped, quietly, practically, with the stubborn, wordless solidarity of people who had chosen to live at the edge of things and understood what that choice meant. Petra made sure the Seathrani's entry permits required daily renewal. The settlement clerk ensured each renewal consumed most of the morning. When the Seathrani requested access to the communication array to contact their home office, the authorization forms went missing. When the forms were found, the array was undergoing maintenance. The settlement's mechanic, a Dranathi named Voss, confirmed the maintenance would take several days, maybe longer. These old systems, you know. The woman who ran the boarding house served the Seathrani food they could technically eat but clearly did not enjoy. The water reclamation team scheduled a maintenance flush that knocked out water pressure to the boarding house for 2 consecutive afternoons. The supply depot ran out of the fuel cells the Seathrani's shuttle required. None of it was coordinated. None of it was discussed. It was simply what happened when a small community decided, without anyone saying a word about it, that the boy in their schoolhouse was their boy and the people who had come for him could wait. On the 17th day, the Seathrani tried a different approach. They found Renchi in the market. Garrett was 20 meters away, buying grain from a Chelseaa trader, when he heard the voice, the flat, translated consonants of the taller enforcer, pitched to carry just far enough to reach the boy. Transit designation T6619. You are the subject of a valid recovery warrant. Garrett turned. Renchi was standing in front of a fruit stall, a canvas bag in one hand. The taller Seathrani was crouched in front of him, crouched to the boy's eye level, mimicking non-threatening posture. Its face was arranged in what might have been intended as concern. The educator cannot protect you. His petition is a delay, not a solution. You understand this. But if you cooperate now, the authority has authorized preferred placement, not the northern mines. A cultural preservation facility. Your knowledge of the 6th choir would be documented and preserved. Renchi stood very still. His ears were flat, not the full fear response, something more controlled, defensive listening. Processing the Seathrani's breathing, heartbeat, the weight shifts that told him whether the creature was telling the truth. Garrett crossed the market in 6 strides. He stepped between the Seathrani and the boy. "You do not approach my student," Garrett said. His voice was low and carried the particular weight of a man who had spent 30 years controlling classrooms. "You do not speak to him. You do not address him by a transit number. His name is Renchi. If you have legal business, you bring it to me or the constable. Not to a child in a market." The Seathrani straightened slowly. It looked at Garrett, and for the first time something shifted behind those amber eyes, not threat, but a recalculation. The look of a predator revising a measurement upward. "Noted," it said, and walked away. Garrett turned to Renchi. The boy's ears were still flat. His hands trembled around the bag. "He was lying," Renchi said quietly. "There is no cultural preservation facility." His heart rate increased when he described it. "I know." "How do you know? You cannot hear heart rates." "Because I've been a teacher for 30 years, and I know what it sounds like when someone tells a child what the child wants to hear so the child will stop resisting." He took the bag from Renchi's shaking hands. "Come on. We need milk before the stall closes." They walked through the market together, and by the time they reached the milk stall, Renchi was walking close enough that their elbows occasionally touched, and neither of them moved away. Renchi noticed. His ears tracked everything, every whispered conversation in the market, every delayed form, every neighbor who brought food to Garrett's door. And slowly, in increments so small they were nearly invisible, the wall began to change. The third door opened at midnight, and it was the hardest. Garrett was awake because he was always awake now, reading filings, drinking coffee that was simply a ritual, giving his hands something to hold. A sound from the storage room, not a word, a hum, low, rhythmic, barely audible. Garrett walked to the doorway. Wrenchy was sitting on the cot, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them, ears flat against his skull, the full fear response. He was rocking slightly, and the sound from his throat was a melodic fragment that repeated and repeated, catching each time it tried to resolve. Garrett did not step inside. He did not crouch down or say it's okay, because he had learned in the years after Laura that people in pain did not need to be told their pain was acceptable. They needed to not be alone in it. He sat down on the floor in the doorway, leaned his back against the frame, and waited. The humming continued, faltered, resumed. Then Wrenchy's voice, barely a thread. The sixth choir sang this, before meals, before sleep, before the burning. It is the only piece I remember completely. It's a good melody. I am the only one who knows it. When I die, it will be gone. The Seathrani will not preserve it. It has no market value. Then it's a good thing you're here to remember it. Silence, the rocking slowed. Garrett. Yeah. I do not want to go to the mine. The words came out stripped of the translator's mechanical precision. They came out the way a child's words come out, thin, unsteady, carrying everything the child cannot say underneath the thing they can. You're not going to the mine, Garrett said. You cannot promise that. The legal framework. Wrenchy. Garrett's voice was quiet, steady, and absolute, the voice of a man who had lost the most important person in his life and had spent 3 years in a canyon at the edge of nowhere, and had decided, somewhere between one breath and the next, that this was the line he would not walk back from. You are not going to the mine. The boy looked at him. In the dark, his eyes were enormous, catching the faint kitchen light the way deep water catches a distant lamp. His face was not composed. His posture was not perfect. He looked, for the first time, exactly like what he was, a child who was afraid and who had found someone he was willing to be afraid in front of. Garrett sat in the doorway until the boy was asleep. Then he went back to the kitchen and read until dawn. The Seathrani made their final move on the 22nd day. Garrett was walking Wrenchy to school, a habit that had formed without discussion, their steps finding a rhythm that accommodated Garrett's longer stride and Wrenchy's tendency to stop and catalog sounds. When the taller enforcer stepped out of the boarding house into their path. Mr. Cole, we have received a response from the Tesseran Reclamation Authority. The juvenile designated T-6619 has been reclassified as a priority cultural asset. The sixth choir held archival records of significant historical value. The juvenile is believed to carry knowledge of their location. A pause. The recovery bounty has been increased. Additional enforcement resources have been requested. A full recovery detail, arriving within the standard transit window. Garrett said nothing. His hands were in his jacket pockets. His face was arranged in the expression he'd worn every morning for 3 weeks, calm, certain, unmoved. Inside, the cold weight in his stomach doubled. More agents. A full detail. They will not be delayed by permit irregularities or maintenance schedules. I see. Mr. Cole, you are an educator on a frontier world. No military training, no legal expertise, no political connections. The compact has recovered assets from fortified compounds, from sovereign territories, from diplomatic shelters with armed guards. A schoolhouse with a blue door is not an obstacle. Garrett stood on the cobblestone and thought about what a person was supposed to say in a moment like this. He had read those stories. He had taught those stories. He knew how the author built the tension and earned the climax. But this was not a story. This was a street at 7 in the morning, and the enemy was not a villain but a bureaucrat, and the line in the sand was not sand but paperwork, and the person standing on it was a tired teacher with bad coffee and no plan beyond the next filing. "You're right," Garrett said. "I'm not an obstacle." The Seathrani's amber eyes flickered. "I'm a custodial claimant with a pending petition in the colonial family authority system, a witnessed filing, a constable who has entered the claim into the settlement's legal record, and a magistrate on Meridian Station who has opened a case file. You can send a full detail. You can send a fleet. Every one of them has to wait for the adjudication, because the moment they remove a minor who is the subject of an active custodial proceeding, they convert a civil matter into a criminal one, and the colonial authority prosecutes those with considerably more enthusiasm than they prosecute anything else." He paused. "I'm a teacher. I know how to make things take a very long time." The Seathrani looked at him for a count of 10. Then it turned and walked back into the boarding house. Beside him, Renchi was silent. His ears were rotating slowly, processing. After a moment, "That was not entirely accurate." "Which part?" "The implication that the colonial authority prosecutes custodial violations with particular enthusiasm. Their enforcement record is inconsistent at best." "Did it sound convincing?" "Yes." "Then it was accurate enough." A pause. Garrett. "Yeah. I have been reading colonial case law on your data terminal while you grade papers. The precedent question you raised, whether the compact can override custodial claims, was partially addressed in a Kelvar sector ruling 11 years ago, but the jurisdictional overlap was different. There may be a stronger argument available through the Cultural Heritage Preservation Act, Section 7, which grants protective status to sole surviving carriers of endangered cultural traditions." Garrett stopped walking. He looked down at the boy. "You've been doing legal research." "I have been doing homework." Garrett stared at him. The boy stared back. And there, fighting through the composure like a green shoot through cracked pavement, the corner of Renchi's mouth twitched. "Come on," Garrett said. "We're going to be late." The resolution came not with a gavel, but with a data packet. 23 days after Renchi first stood on the front step, the colonial magistrate issued a preliminary ruling. Garrett read it at his kitchen table, coffee going cold, Renchi eating oatmeal across from him, with the same demolitions expert concentration he'd brought to the first morning. The ruling stated, pending full adjudication of competing claims, and noting the applicability of the Cultural Heritage Preservation Act, Section 7, to the minor's status as the sole surviving carrier of 6th Choir musical and archival traditions. The minor known as Renchi was to remain in the custodial care of the petitioner, Garrett Cole, within the educational jurisdiction of the Caldera Valley Settlement School. The recovery warrant was suspended. The Seathrani enforcement agents were directed to vacate the settlement within 48 hours. It was not a victory. It was a comma, a legal pause in a sentence that had not yet ended. The compact would appeal. The process would grind on. But the Seathrani left. Garrett watched them go from the school window, two tall copper-skinned figures walking down the cobblestone, their gait as patient and unhurried as the day they'd arrived. They would be back, or others like them would come. But today they left, and today was the only day that ever mattered. "Garrett," Renchi said from his desk. "Yeah." "The ruling is preliminary. It does not constitute permanent custody." "I know. The compact will appeal. The probability of a successful permanent adoption, even with the cultural heritage argument, is approximately 34%. "I know. You are still going to fight it." "Yes." "Why?" Garrett turned from the window. The classroom was empty, just the two of them, the morning light, the chalkboard with yesterday's lesson still on it. He looked at the boy. Ash-gray skin, silver-threaded ears, enormous dark eyes, hands resting on the desk, resting, not pressed flat, not gripping. The knuckles were not white. "Because 6 is the number of moons on Tessara," Garrett said. "And 6 is the number of songs your mother sang. And 6 is the number of days you were alone. And none of those numbers should be the end of the count." Renchi looked at him for a long time. The ears rotated slowly, processing something that had nothing to do with sound. Then the boy stood, walked to the chalkboard, picked up a piece of chalk and wrote in his precise, factory-clean handwriting. 7, the number of songs Mr. Cole hums while grading papers. He does not know he does this. Garrett stared at the board. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I do not hum while grading papers." "You do, every evening. The melody is inconsistent, but the rhythm is steady. For 4 time. You hum louder when the student has done well." "That's ridiculous." "It is accurate." Garrett looked at the boy. The boy looked back. And there, no longer fighting the composure but breaking clean through it, the way light breaks through a crack in a wall that is held for a very long time, was a smile. Small, uncertain, real. Garrett sat down at his desk. He picked up his coffee. He drank it and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying better. Outside, the cobblestone street was waking up. A vendor opened a stall. A door closed somewhere. The morning light crept along the canyon wall and turned the dust to gold. In the classroom, a teacher and his students sat together, and the count went on.